Hi, welcome to Reporting Serious Incidents. Before we get started today, a few ground rules. Remember, there's one test per person, one test per applicant or participant or parent, however you want to phrase it. You do have to show your own individual competency. Today's test is 10 questions long. It's 2 pages. Upon the completion of your test, you're going to turn this into your Pathways Family Specialist or Pathways Home Developer. So please make sure that that is turned into them. They will grade it, upload it to the file, and provide a certificate with it. So let's get started. Reporting serious incidents. What is the definition of a serious incident? This is number 1 on your test. And looking at this definition, also pay particular attention to number 1. We may have worded it a little bit differently. A serious incident is a non-routine occurrence that has or may have dangerous or significant consequences on the care, supervision, and treatment of a child. The different types of serious incidents, and this is number 3 on your test. We're going to skip around just a little bit to kind of keep you on your toes. The types of serious incidents. Should we come into contact with a communicable disease? On here, our first bullet point shows you not only a phone number to call, but the website as well. So please make sure that you do report that. If you come in contact with a communicable disease or contract it, COVID in particular, because this is in the height of the pandemic time, please make sure that you're reporting that to your Pathways Family Specialist or a Pathways staff member as soon as possible. We do have 24 hours to report that, but we want to make sure that we're getting that information as quickly as possible. If you do an at-home test or go through a drive-through type situation where they do the testing and you do test positive, you immediately have to report to a healthcare professional. So please make sure that you're following through with those. We're going to cover that again when we get to the different types of serious incidents. Below that, we see allegations of abuse or neglect. If a child in your home makes allegations of abuse or neglect in a previous home environment, whether that was with their caregivers, a previous foster home, shelter, residential facility, kinship caregiver, we do have to report that. Attempted suicide. Now, this is attempted suicide. This is not suicidal ideation. These are 2 different things. Suicidal ideation could be a child saying, I just want to die, I just want to kill myself. And maybe that's because they don't have the appropriate words to present themselves. So we want to make sure, that this truly is, first of all, we want to make sure that we follow through with contacting Pathways and our therapist and those different types of people that are involved in the child's life. But also with attempted suicide, we're looking more at the child has actually slit their wrist, tried to overdose on a medication, hung themselves, some type of attempted suicide. Commission of a crime. This actually has some added language to it. We're going to visit just a little bit more here in a few slides from now. These used to be separate. They have now grouped these together as one, but consensual activity between children with more than 24 months age difference or significant developmental level, non-consensual sexual activity between children of any age, sexual abuse committed by a child against another child. Anytime one of these happens, this is a serious incident. The death of a child, ER, medical hospitalization. We've taken the child to the emergency room because maybe they were running temperature, they were croupy, and the doctor says, let's admit them into the hospital for observation. Maybe it's possibly pneumonia or the beginning stages of pneumonia, so they want to admit them for possible observation. That's going to be an ER medical hospitalization. Injury requiring medical attention, broken bones, stitches. Non-routine medical treatment without hospitalization. If we go to the emergency room and they do any type of treatment, that could be a nebulizer, breathing treatment, any type of treatment that was conducted within the emergency room or by the doctor, that is non-routine medical treatment without hospitalization. Occurrence of abuse or neglect. Again, this kind of goes with allegations of abuse or neglect. Occurrence of abuse or neglect could happen while the child is in your care by someone that is involved in the child's life. That could be teaching personnel, people within the church, Boy Scout leaders, sports coaches, a variety of people that may have contact with that child, next door neighbors, extended family members. Physical abuse committed by a child against another child. A runaway or a child is absent and cannot be located. We have 3 different criteria for that we're going to look at. But always, when in doubt, report to the Pathways staff immediately, because let us make that determination if this truly is a serious incident or not. Some serious incidents require us to document it. We just call that more of an incident, whereas a serious incident is reportable. So there's reportable and non-reportable there. But always report it to us when in doubt. So who do we make those reports to? It is a licensing standard that the foster parent must be the one to report any type of incident directly to the Child Abuse Hotline if the incident involves a child under the care of the foster parent. So there's different types of criteria and timeframes we're going to look at, but when we're making those reports of a serious incident, you're always going to contact Pathways first. Run it past us. Let's go through the incident. Let's talk about it. Once we determine if this is a reportable serious incident that we have to report to the Child Abuse Hotline, or maybe this is a non-reportable serious incident where you document it in your foster parent notes, and we as Pathways document it in our case management notes, and then we probably will also notify CPS in some situations. But always call Pathways first. Now, if we determine this is a reportable serious incident, you as the foster parent are going to have to call this into the Child Abuse Hotline. That hotline is 1-800-252-5400. We can also report this on the website at the link listed in this PowerPoint slide at www.txabusehotline.org. Preferably, I like to call it into the hotline. That's just me. I want to talk to somebody. I want to know their name, their call ID number. I want the intake ID number. I want all of that information rather than hoping that it went through on a website and waiting for that email confirmation or knowing that there was a glitch in something. So that's just my preference. Law enforcement. There are some situations where we do have to call law enforcement, such as the death of a child or the child that is run away or not present. So that's where we would have to contact them. So remember, these reports are time sensitive, and it depends on the entity with who we're reporting to as to what that time frame is. So here's a really handy chart. If you ever want a copy of this, we can provide this chart to you if it's a good reference point. But here we break it down, the type of the serious incident, who do we report it to, licensing. In our world, we have to remember when we say parents, we're talking about CPS and then to law enforcement. So in the instance of a death of a child, more often than not, if you're a medically fragile foster home that is on with us tonight, this is the instance that we normally see. We have a lot of our medically fragile children that do have a terminal diagnosis. And so if that child does have a terminal diagnosis, they can be with hospice, surrounded by everybody that cares for that child when they take their final breaths. And when that happens, we still have to follow the same time frame. We have to immediately report this to residential child care regulations, RCCR. We have we can go no longer than 2 hours after the death of the child to report this. We prefer to get that done immediately. Immediately, we also need to report this to CPS as quickly as we can. And then in this situation, we also report it to law enforcement. Now, even if the child has a terminal diagnosis, they're with hospice, the treating physician may have been present at the child's final breaths, but we still have to report this to law enforcement. Now, law enforcement will come out, and usually it's an open and shut case once they see the child's diagnosis and everything that was going on. But sometimes around the state of Texas, we have seen children pass in rollover accidents and vehicle accidents. It's the #1 leading cause of death of children is motor vehicle accidents, if you remember that from your transportation training, safety training. And then there are rollover accidents, backover accidents, where a parent may think the child is in the home, they didn't check around the car before backing out of the driveway. So there are those types of things, kids playing in the street and struck by a vehicle. So that would still be under that same situation there. We have to report those incidents in the same manner. But hopefully, more often than not, within Pathways, we're talking about our medically fragile foster homes with children that do have a terminal diagnosis. The next one on our list is a substantial physical injury or critical illness that a reasonable person would conclude needs treatment by a medical professional or hospitalization. So this is where, whether we're going to an emergency room, urgent care, or to a doctor's office, if the child needs stitches, if they have a broken bone, any of those types of things. The example I used earlier about a child running temperature, being croupy, we go to the doctor's office, we go to the emergency room, they determine they have pneumonia or beginning stages of pneumonia, and they hospitalize them. So any of those would fall under this criteria. Now, again, we do have to report this to licensing, but our time frame changes here a little bit than the previous one. We have up to 24 hours to report this to licensing. However, with CPS, we have to report it immediately after we have made sure that everything is safe. The child has received their stitches, they've got the cast on their arm, everything is taken care of. Now we have to report that immediately to CPS. We do not have to report this to law enforcement. So again, always you want to call your Pathways family specialist. If you are headed to urgent care, to an emergency room or to the doctor's office in the event that there was physical injury or critical illness. Please keep us in the loop on that. Allegations of abuse, neglect, or exploitation of a child, or any incident where there's an indication that a child in care may have been abused, neglected, or exploited. So again, this could come to us and when a child has been in your home 6 months or longer, maybe they entered care due to neglect. And now they're starting to confide in you because they're comfortable, they feel safe. And so they start telling you allegations of other things that we did not know that happened. Sexual abuse, physical abuse to a sibling, things that may have happened that we were not aware of. So as soon as we become aware of this, we have to report it to licensing. Now, this is a standard that changed a couple of years ago to include as soon as we become aware of it. So let me give you an example. Let's say we are tucking a child into bed at night. And that child, again, feels comfortable with you, they feel safe, and they start disclosing sexual abuse. Do not ask that child questions. Allow them to tell their story. Once they're done, reassure them how brave they are for telling you, and they did the right thing by telling you that a child is not a child's responsibility to put boundaries. It's an adult responsibility to keep children safe. Once we have that talk with them and get them tucked into bed, again, immediately contact Pathways to let us know what happened. And then you, per licensing standards, have to call Residential Child Care Regulations hotline number 1-800-252-5400 and to report abuse or neglect. And we are going to make sure that that is reported. We're going to also make sure we report this to CPS. Now, if this happens late at night, we would probably do this in the form of an email because CPS workers aren't on call 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. So we want to make sure that we get this reported to them as quickly as possible too. Again, we do not have to report this to law enforcement in this situation. The next one on our list is physical abuse committed by a child against another child. Now, they've added some language to this. So it says, for the purpose of this subsection, physical abuse occurs when there is substantial physical injury, excluding any accident, or failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent an action by another person that results in substantial physical injury to the child. So if we have two children, let's say we have two boys outside playing basketball and they get in a shoving match and we get between them, we break them up, we send one in the house to go cool down, the other one in the backyard, we're talking to them, we calm them down. Nothing happened. That's a reportable incident. You want to make sure that you report that to us so that we can document it, but it doesn't require an intake to the hotline. So we're not going to call that into the child abuse hotline. That was a shoving match. It did not result in any physical injury. So if those, let's say the same incidents, the two boys were out there playing basketball, now they got into a fist fight and they broke each other's nose, there's blood, that requires medical attention. That is substantial physical injury. So that's where we would then take care of that injury first. And as soon as we become aware of it, we're going to report that again to Pathways first, but we're going to make sure we get that called into the licensing hotline into CPS as soon as possible, as soon as we become aware of it. And so we do not have to report that to law enforcement. But again, this is physical abuse committed by a child against another child where there is substantial physical injury, or we did not try to get in between the two children to break up the fight. We just stood there and let it happen and watched them until they hurt each other. So that would not be, we would not be intervening to keep that from happening there. On our next list, sexual abuse committed by a child against another child. For the purpose of this subsection, sexual abuse is conduct harmful to the child's mental, emotional, or physical welfare, including non-consensual sexual activity between children of any age, and consensual sexual activity between children with more than 24 months age difference, and when there's a significant difference in the developmental level of the children, or there is failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent sexual conduct harmful to a child. So in this situation, if we did find in our home where two children were sexually acting out with one another, again, you need to report that to Pathways immediately. And then you as the foster parent, we have to call that into the hotline, 1-800-252-5400, as well as to CPS. Also, it says in here, if there's failure to make a reasonable effort. So let's say we knew a child has a history of sexual acting out, and we put that child into another room with a child that is vulnerable to that child sexually acting out on them. And we did nothing, we didn't put any precautions in place. We didn't put a baby monitor in place. We didn't put, we didn't do nighttime checks on the children and those different types of measures to keep the child safe. Then that would be a failure to make a reasonable effort to prevent sexual conduct harmful to a child. So that kind of also goes into that section as well. The next one on here, a child is indicted, charged, or arrested for a crime, not including being issued a ticket at school by law enforcement or any other citation that does not result in the child being detained, or when law enforcement responds to an alleged incident at the foster home. So a couple of scenarios here. So for the first one, we say if a child is at school and they get a ticket for truancy, for skipping class, maybe they used inappropriate language with a teacher or a threat to a teacher or another student, and they get a citation. That's not an arrest of a child, a commission of a crime. So that's being issued a citation. Or if the child was at your home, and let's say they became physically aggressive, or they brought drugs into the home and you called law enforcement to help in that situation, that does not issue a child being detained or arrested for a commission of a crime. They're responding to an incident there. So we don't, in those situations, we do not have to report that to licensing. Now we would, again, report that to Pathways so that we can document it. We also want to report that to CPS in those situations where they do get a citation or police do come to your home. Now, if a child is arrested for the commission of a crime, they got caught shoplifting at Target, they got caught dealing drugs at school, or caught with drugs on them at school, and they became arrested. So when a child is arrested, that is when we have to report that to licensing. Now, again, if you look in our little columns here, we have to report that to licensing as soon as possible, but no later than 24 hours. So we have a little bit of time frame there to get that reported to licensing. However, we do have to report this to CPS as soon as we become aware of it. Again, you're going to always contact Pathways first, and then we're going to let CPS know in that situation. In that situation, we do not have to report it to law enforcement. So that's when a child is indicted, charged, or arrested. That's number 2 on your test. Here's our we have 3 different criterias for children that become absent or classified as a runaway. So the first one here is the unauthorized absence of a child who is developmentally or chronologically under the age of 6. If a child is absent or they run away from us, we have up to 2 hours to report that to licensing after we've notified law enforcement. The same standard for CPS. We have up to 2 hours of notifying CPS once we've notified law enforcement. But look at our law enforcement section. It says, yes, we have to report it to them, and we have to report it to them immediately. Once we determine that we cannot locate that child, we have to make sure that we're keeping that child safe. Our children 0 to 6 years old are very much more vulnerable population. So we've got to make sure we're responding fast. That child could be abducted, so we want to be quick with that. So then we have, after notifying law enforcement, we have up to 2 hours to report that to licensing. That's also number 7 on your test if you're referencing it. Now, our next one on here, the unauthorized absence of a child who is developmentally or chronologically 6 to 12 years old. So again, same situation here. Yes, we have to report it to licensing within 2 hours of notifying law enforcement if the child is still missing. So they added a little sentence on there, if the child is still missing. We also have to report it to CPS, same situation, within 2 hours of determining the child is not on the premises if the child is still missing. And then law enforcement, we have to report it to them within 2 hours of determining the child is not on the premises if the child is still missing. Here's my words of advice, guys. I would call law enforcement immediately. How do we show that we're protecting the child? If they're 6 to 12 years old, even if we've kind of exhausted our resources, we checked with our next door neighbors to make sure they didn't walk out and go to somebody's house and we just didn't know about it, whatever it may be, notify law enforcement. If we cannot physically see that child, by notifying law enforcement is our best way of keeping that child safe when they're not in our supervision. So that's my words of advice to you. Best case practice, I would call law enforcement immediately and report to them so that we can have their help. Now, if that child does show up and go, I was just down the street at so-and-so's house, you know, it's better to be safe than sorry. So that's our children 6 to 12 years old. And then here's our third criteria, which is our children 13 and older. And you can see we have a long list here. So with licensing and to CPS, we do have to report it to them. It says, no later than 6 hours from when the child's absence is discovered and the child is still missing. However, here's our long caveat that was just added this last year. You must report the child's absence immediately if the child has previously been alleged or determined to be a trafficking victim, or if you believe the child has been abducted, or, third or here, has no intention of returning to the foster home. So if we have an older child that is mad and they said, I'm out of here, I'm never coming back again, and they leave, we know they have no intention of returning. So that's when we would go on and report that to law enforcement and to licensing. But if we have a child in our care that we know has a history of being trafficked, or we have a assumption that they're possibly being trafficked or abducted, we need to move a whole lot faster there. And so with law enforcement, yes, we have to report it to law enforcement. No later, my little picture is covering it up here, no later than 6 hours from when the child's absence is discovered and the child is still missing. However, you must report the child's absence immediately if the child has previously been alleged or determined to be a trafficking victim, or you believe the child has been abducted or has no intention of returning to the foster home. So we still have 6 hours to report that to law enforcement. Again, immediately report this to Pathways. Talk to us about it. Let's process it. Let's go through the scenario, what's gone on there, the process of events. Again, more often than not, sometimes we may want to go on and notify law enforcement so we can keep that child safe. But always staff it with your Pathways family specialist and their supervisor, determine that best case, because every scenario is different. So we always want to make sure you're staffing that with us. So that's our children 13 years and older that are absent or possibly run away. A child, foster parent, or household member in your care contracts a communicable disease that the law requires you to report to the Department of State Health Services. So here, this is one of your test questions. Trying to remember which one it was. It is number 8 on your test. Sorry about that. I thought I had these down. So number 8 on your test. Now, again, this is you want to report this to Pathways as soon as possible. And more often than not, right now with our communicable diseases, we're seeing COVID every week, multiple times a week across the state. So please make sure you're reporting. This isn't just a foster child. This is a household member, a foster parent, or a child that lives in the home. We have to know that information. If you do an at-home test, if you do a drive-through test, please notify us immediately at the positive results, and then we have to follow through with going to a physician. So make sure you're getting that to us. Now, on here, it clearly says we have up to 24 hours to report this. Please be immediate, guys, because there is a series of events that we have to go through. It's not just reporting it to the hotline. There's other things that go into place here. So please, as quickly as possible, notify your Pathway staff as soon as you become aware of it so that we can start that process. Other types of communicable diseases we might see: tuberculosis, hepatitis. There are a couple of sexually transmitted diseases that are on that list as well. So, but more often than not, right now with the pandemic, it is COVID, and we've got to make sure we're getting those reported to us as quickly as possible so that we can get through those steps. We do not have to report this to law enforcement. So that is reporting our when a person comes into contact or contracts a communicable disease. Serious incident. This is a suicide attempt by a child. We kind of talked about this earlier. This isn't suicidal ideation or saying things like, I just want to kill myself, I wish I was dead. This is truly a suicide attempt. A lot of times if the child attempts suicide, we're going to be calling 911 or going directly to the emergency room. We have to report this as soon as we become aware of it. Call Pathways, let us know what is going on. I know it's a moment of crisis. Please keep us in the loop. We have to report this to licensing and to CPS as soon as we become aware of it. So again, keep us in the loop of those situations. This is attempt. This is swallowing pills, cutting the wrist, hanging themselves, any type of true attempt in this situation. Now, when we notify Pathways staff immediately in case of any of the following, and these are things that can happen on a regular basis. Knowledge of impending change of residence for the foster family. If you live in an apartment or you rent a house and your lease is about to expire and you're thinking, I'm not going to stay here anymore, we're going to move somewhere else, please let us know immediately so that we are aware of the change in address. We have to update that in the class database. We have to update that in our ER database. We have to come out to your home and do a walkthrough for the health inspection, the fire inspection. We have to make sure that all of those compliances are being met. So please keep us in mind. If you're renewing your lease elsewhere, or you're putting your house up for sale, and that usually happens during the summer. May is where we see families tend to put their house on the market and decide to make that move. Any change in household composition of the foster home. If you have a biological child that's graduating high school and moving off to college, that's a change in composition. If you have a child that is graduating college and moving home while they get a job and get their feet on the ground, that's a change in composition as well. If you were going to have a relative or a friend move in with you, we see this happen. Please let us know immediately, because we have to run that person's background check. We have to get their FBI fingerprints processed. We have to get TB tests. So please make sure that we're getting that done. If this was a child in college, maybe we had them run as a frequent visitor. We're going to have to rerun that background check as a household member if they're moving home. So even then, there could be that we may have had a background check in place. We have to change that because it now requires an FBI fingerprinting. So please keep us in the loop of any change in household composition. Any change in the foster family's financial, employment, or health status. If you got a job promotion, if you changed jobs, if you were laid off at the beginning of COVID, we saw a lot of families that were laid off from their jobs. It was a very scary time and things were going on. Guys, this does not mean we're going to remove children from your home, but you do have to keep us in the loop so that we're maintaining stress levels, we're watching the budget situation and everything that goes into effect with that. Health status. Again, if you or a child in your home or a household member is diagnosed with anything such as cancer, we need to know about that information. And again, it's not going to result in children being removed from your home. It's making sure that Pathways is offering you the support that you need, because there is going to be a higher stress level happen within the home, and we have to make sure that everybody is safe and being taken care of, and that we're meeting your needs as a family. Any change in sleeping arrangements for the foster children. Sometimes we have this happen to where once a family's licensed, they choose to move the rooms around from a room that was not identified as a foster child's bedroom, maybe it's a guest bedroom, but please keep us updated on that so that we can relabel the floor plan and do an addendum to the home study. I'll give you an example. We had a family here in Houston that was licensed for medically fragile children, and they had a 2-story home. Once they were licensed and we placed children in the home, they made the decision to move their bedroom upstairs and allow the children to have the primary bedroom. That way it was not only a bigger room, but if there was a fire, it was easier to get the children out of the home rather than carrying them down the stairs. So we just had to update that in the addendum of the home study and change that floor plan up a little bit. So please let us know if there's a change in sleeping arrangements. Any other circumstances which causes the foster family to experience unusual stress. And again, we just want to make sure we're offering you the appropriate services and we're meeting your needs as a family to help with that stress level. If any household member is arrested for any reason, the foster parent, your biological child, a roommate, if your adult children live with you, whatever that might look like for you, we will be notified usually within 24 hours by residential child care regulations that there has been an arrest, a change in that background check. Please let us know so that we can beat them to the punch. So when they do call us, we're aware of it. We have a safety plan in place. We've already put protocols in place that need to be taken. So please be transparent about that. It may be embarrassing, but we've got to know so that we're completely there to be able to advocate for you as well whenever we receive that call. If a foster parent becomes hospitalized or ill to the point of not being able to care for children. So if you are hospitalized, and we saw this again with COVID, where families were being hospitalized and the children were being left with babysitters, respite care providers, we just have to make sure all of our policies are being met, all state licensing regulations are being met, that the people that are watching the children have the appropriate clearances, CPR, first aid, and those different types of things to care for the child. So not only that, we want to make sure that we're helping you in that time of need and meeting your needs as well. So please be transparent and keep us informed of those situations. Safety plans. Now, depending on the type of serious incident report, it may be necessary for the child's treatment team to implement a safety plan. So this may happen when there's a child that has self-harming behaviors, such as cutting, drinking detergents or soaps, locking up. So what we would do is lock up all sharp objects, knives, scissors, and detergents. So if we did have a child that had self-injurious behavior, self-harming behaviors, those are the steps that we would want to make sure that we took to keep that child safe by locking up any knives, scissors, the detergents. Maybe we would change a doorknob out on a linen closet or the pantry to one that has a key, and that's where those sharp objects or chemicals go so that that child does not have access to them. Sexual acting out. If we have a child that does have sexual acting out behaviors, we can put protocols in place, such as placing baby monitors in the room, doing random checks throughout the night. If the child has their own bedroom, maybe placing a motion sensor on the door. So if they do come out of their bedroom at night, we know that that child is up and about the house so that we can check and make sure they're not going in another child's bedroom. But we want to make sure that we have these protocols in place to ensure the safety and well-being of other children in the home. A suicide attempt. This is where we would probably put more closer supervision in place. We want to keep that child in eyesight during waking hours. That child caregiver or therapist, we want to make sure that we have a contract in place for their safety. A few years ago in our Dallas office, we had a child that was going to be admitted in the hospital, but the hospital was full, the psychiatric hospital. And so in that situation, the child had to go back home to the family. We put a safety plan in place to where the child was on a pallet in the living room. The parents slept on the couch to keep that child in site supervision. And even our Pathways family specialist went over and helped with some of that supervision. They also had their backup respite provider in there as well, but it was only a short amount of time that had to happen. Don't know that I've ever heard of that incident ever happening again across the state where there was not capacity in a psychiatric hospital, but that's just an example to kind of give you there. Pathways does have the right to revoke a foster family's verification if you do not follow the safety plan. The safety plan is meant to keep the child safe or other children in the home safe. So we want to make sure that that's taken very seriously and that you are following that safety plan. Remember, it's the reason, not the location of the incident. So we're always looking at the reason here. If we go to the emergency room or emergency clinic that did not result in the hospitalization, let's say we went for a common illness like the flu. They were running temperature, the doctor sees them even at the emergency room or urgent care, they write a prescription for medication and they send them home. That's not a reportable serious incident. Now, again, you do want to report that to Pathways so that we can document it, that we can make sure, we let CPS know that they're sick, they went to the emergency room, but it's not one that requires us to call the hotline. However, if we take a child to the emergency clinic or a doctor's office for stitches or a broken bone, or we went to the emergency room and that resulted in a hospitalization, that is a reportable serious incident. So now we do have to report that to the hotline, the 1-800-252-5400, or the web address that I gave you earlier, because that is resulting in a critical illness or substantial physical injury. Should a doctor on the medical evaluation form state that a child needs to have a follow-up appointment in a specific time frame, this has to be followed through with and can be a citable standard violation. So let's say we did go to the emergency room or the doctor, your general pediatrician, and the child broke their arm. And they said it, they put a cast, and they said, you need to go to a pediatric or orthopedic doctor within 7 days. We have to make sure that we made that contact and we're going to that doctor within 7 days. If that doctor could not see us within 7 days, let's say you live in a smaller town in Texas where there's not an abundance of people for that specialty, then we need to make sure we have some type of written documentation from the doctor's office stating why they could not see that child until after that time frame. But please make sure we're following through with those follow-up visits that's written on the medical evaluation form. So how do we make a report? If, again, we have a reportable serious incident, it is a licensing standard that the foster parent has to be the one that calls the Texas Abuse Neglect Hotline, because you have firsthand knowledge is the philosophy behind that. So notify that child abuse hotline. Again, it's 1-800-252-5400. When you call, the time frames have gotten a lot shorter. There's usually about a 5-minute wait. Once they come online, the things they're going to ask us for is to provide the child's name, their date of birth, and your address. They're going to also ask you for your agency's information, which is Pathways Youth and Family Services, in case you forgot, and your caseworker's information, your CPS caseworker. Once you go through everything with that intake worker and explain the series of events and everything that had happened, once they conclude the call, they're going to give you their name. They're going to give you their intake specialist ID and a call ID. So they may say, my name is Scott Batson. Your intake specialist ID is 2424, and the call ID is 1445. So make sure you write all that information down. You're going to have to provide that to Pathways because this is now going to go into our serious incident report. So when Pathways receives that information, we put together what's called a serious incident report. And this is created in our extended reach database. So it creates the document for us, and we go through and we're going to have to type in the name of the foster and adoptive family, the time of the incident, the name, age of the child, and is there an admission? Like, did the child get admitted to the hospital, the psychiatric hospital? If there was a hospital, if this was an incident that involved a hospitalization. The name of any adults involved, that could have been the doctor in the emergency room. If this was in the home and the child became violent and had to be restrained and they were attempted suicide, who was there? Was the therapist there? Was there a next door neighbor there? Like, who is there that can CPS can call as a collateral in finding out details to that situation? The nature of the incident, what went on, what happened, circumstances surrounding the incident, interventions that were made. If this was two children that were getting into a physical altercation, how did you break up the fight? How did you intervene? If this was two children we caught sexually acting out on one another, how did you intervene in those situations? And then the medical professional's name, findings, and treatment. If this was something that resulted in a hospitalization, critical illness, substantial physical injury, and the resolution of the incident. So you'll give us all that information. We're going to type it up. It's important to remember whenever we create that document in our path in the extended reach database, it timestamps it. So we kind of tell on ourselves. So when it's timestamping all that information, we have to give that information to residential child care regulations once they contact us about the investigation. So please make sure that we are following those time frames. Do not delay in contacting Pathways so that we have sufficient time to prepare for that. And then lastly, what is the difference between residential child care regulations versus CPS? Calling the hotline to make a report sends a report to residential child care regulations, that 1-800-252-5400. Whenever you make that report, the licensing rep for the Pathways office and the city that you reside in is going to be notified. So that goes to them. CPS is notified in Impact. That is CPS's database, and it's called Impact. So when they log into their computer the next morning, they're going to get an alert that says, hey, you have a child on your caseload that is now involved in an investigation or an incident. So that's how they're going to get it on their Impact. But hopefully we as Pathways have already notified them on the phone, through text message, through email, that this is already going on. And then residential child care regulations is the entity within DFPS that is responsible for making sure that Pathways and foster parents continues to abide by all state licensing standards, minimum standards. Remember, if you ever wanted to look at residential child care regulations minimum standards, when you log into the family web of your extended reach database, the main page, I think it's called the newsroom. If you scroll all the way down to the bottom in the lower right corner, there's a link to residential child care licensing minimum standards. There's about 453 pages of rules. If you wanted to log in, you're more than welcome to look through those and do your own studying and making yourself aware of the different rules that we have to follow. Then residential child care regulations will request Pathways to send the serious incident report following the time that they get the call and get that information. So please make sure licensing is the government entity that regulates and oversees Pathways. They're the ones that, like I said, we have all the rules we have to follow. If you ever have questions about rules and regulations, ask Pathways so that we can guide you appropriately don't ask your CPS worker. Many times, CPS workers are not well versed in minimum standards. They don't have to be. That's not their job. So please make sure, don't ask your CPS worker about a rule you have to follow, or can somebody babysit without having a background check, or always run that past pathways so that we can give you the correct answer, that we can research our licensing regulations and make sure that we are following through with those correctly. So that concludes everything for reporting serious incidents. Please, again, make sure that you turn your test into your Pathways Home Developer or your Pathways Family Specialist. And those are the ones that are going to grade that test, turn that into you, and upload that to your file and assign the hours to it. So other than that, guys, that's all that I have. Thank you for joining us. Please reach out. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to me. My email is sbatson@pathway.org. But more importantly, your Pathways Family Specialist or your program manager for your Pathways Family Specialist, their supervisor, because they're going to be able to answer things that are more local in your area and probably more pertinent to your case. So thank you all for joining us. And we will see you next time.